Let's start with the big news out of Mexico this week, which is the turnover, the resignation of the Minister of Finance from the so-called Hacienda. What is going on there? Because this individual had been very close to President Lopez Obrador back when he was running Mexico City.
Right, indeed. He's worked with Lopez Obrador for decades. And I think one of the most surprising things was not just that he resigned, but the way in which he resigned. He resigned with a, frankly, brutal letter about policy differences and interference in the running of the finance secretariat. And what you have, I think, is a situation in which the very grandiose projects and dreams of the president are running headlong into what has become almost a national religion in Mexico, which is fiscal discipline, which Lopez Obrador has also promised to continue. And it's hard to see how those two things are going to be achieved at the same time. He calmed markets by immediately appointing Arturo Herrera, who's a well-known quantity and also very prudent. But it's not clear that Herrera is not going to have the same differences with the president as his predecessor.
And how does this figure into U.S.-Mexican trade relations? We have the USMCA, the successor to NAFTA, of course, that's negotiated, sitting on Congress's desk. How does that play politically in Mexico right now?
Well, I think, obviously Mexico has already ratified the USMCA. And they did so quite quickly, and even though the U.S. had not ratified. I think it's critically important to both countries that the treaty be ratified. It updates some parts of NAFTA, which was one of the earliest trade agreements that are essential. And I will say that this administration has known from the beginning, the Trump administration, that they were going to need Democrats to get USMCA passed. And to do that, Mexico had to make changes in its labor code and its labor enforcement. And that has passed in Mexico as well, which improved the chances for USMCA. But it's still a very hard slog. And we have recent indications that seem somewhat positive from Democrats, but not, perhaps before the August break. And then it becomes very difficult as you get closer to an election. So I think there's still a chance that USMCA gets ratified, which I think is critical for certainty in the markets. But I have to say, those get slimmer as you get past this calendar year.
You wrote publicly about your criticism of the Trump administration for its chaotic form of policymaking, particularly with respect to Mexico. No matter how chaotic it was, did they come out in a pretty good place? I mean, as you look at the substance of the USMCA, is it a pretty good agreement?
Well, I think USMCA is actually a pretty good agreement, but I would point out that something like 85%, or USMCA represents about 85% of it is what was in TPP. And so, in my opinion, the big failure is not what you got in USMCA, which I think is a decent agreement and should be ratified. The big failure is that we could have moved ahead with TPP, which would have done the updating of NAFTA plus, right, by getting all of those Asian Pacific countries into the agreement as well, and especially as you look at confronting China. So I believe strongly that USMCA is a good agreement. I think those who are concerned about environment or labor standards need to think about the fact that those issues are not going to get any better without USMCA. It may not be a perfect agreement, but it is very good and updates critical issues such as e-commerce, which didn't exist under the first NAFTA, and the energy sector, which was unable to be touched back when NAFTA was passed. So I think it's a critical agreement. It's a good agreement, and it needs to be implemented. But there are lots of reasons why the economic and commercial relationship is not going as far as it should outside of a treaty, and that has to do with some fairly arbitrary and capricious decision-making on both sides of the border on things that don't necessarily make sense economically for the two countries. So
finally, we've been watching what I think it's fair to say is a crisis on our southern border, is particularly the unaccompanied minors have been coming across in larger and larger numbers. President Trump said we're going to threaten tariffs if Mexico doesn't do something about it. They got some accommodation. And now we're seeing the numbers tick down some. Is that potentially a success story for the administration?
Well, I mean, I guess you could consider it a short-term success because, indeed, the numbers have gone down. The question is, does it really get at the root causes, and therefore, is it sustainable? And in my opinion, it does not. You have Mexico expending resources it frankly doesn't really have in the very short term to make numbers go down, combined with the summer months in which numbers always go down. But the fact is that they're addressing a humanitarian crisis that is largely of the administration's making because it threatened to close the border, build a wall, and because there aren't other ways other than asylum for laborers, for migrants to come to the United States. The fact is we need to do two things. One is attack the root causes of migration, which are in the home countries, and this administration has cut off aid to the home countries, which is counterproductive for these issues. But the second is you need to actually pass comprehensive immigration reform, which all of this country's business leaders believe is necessary, so that you can actually give people a way to come and return in circular migration, which is what you should have.